Hello, and welcome to Sleep Archive. When we look up at the night sky, our perspective is entirely shaped by the warmth of our own star. We live on a planet forged from liquid rock and heavy metals, orbiting dangerously close to a massive, continuous thermonuclear explosion. Our definition of geology is built entirely on the physics of heat. We understand volcanoes as localized vents for molten silicate, and we understand oceans as massive, shallow pools of liquid water constantly warmed by solar radiation. But this warm, terrestrial architecture is an absolute anomaly. It is a tiny, localized pocket of heat in an otherwise freezing, infinite void. If we leave the inner solar system and travel outward, drifting past the rusted deserts of Mars and navigating the chaotic, tumbling debris of the asteroid belt, the physical rules of reality begin to violently change. The radiant heat of the sun continuously dissipates, shrinking until it is nothing more than a singularly bright star in a sea of absolute black. We enter the realm of the gas giants. This is a region defined by crushing planetary gravity, chaotic magnetic fields, and extreme, inescapable cold. To human intuition, a world locked in the outer dark should be completely dead. A moon made entirely of ice, floating in a vacuum that is hundreds of degrees below zero, should mechanically be a static, frozen tomb. Without the sun to melt the surface and drive the weather, there should be no physical erosion, no tectonic movement, and absolutely no geological engine. But the outer solar system is completely deceptive. As we strip away our terrestrial bias and look closely at the physical mechanics of these frozen moons, we realize they are not dead. They are highly active, violently powerful thermodynamic engines. They are planetary forges that operate on a completely inverted set of physical laws, building massive subterranean oceans, shifting tectonic plates, and explosive volcanoes entirely in the dark. This is the architecture of the void. To truly understand the mechanical engines of the outer solar system, we must completely erase our terrestrial understanding of what constitutes a rock and what constitutes a liquid. On Earth, the thick atmospheric pressure and the immediate proximity to the sun allow water to exist primarily in a fluid state. It is soft, yielding, and highly chemically reactive. But as we travel hundreds of millions of miles outward to the massive orbital tracks of Jupiter and Saturn, the ambient temperature of space plummets to roughly 300 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. In this extreme thermodynamic environment, water behaves completely differently. It is instantly stripped of all its kinetic energy. The rapidly vibrating molecules are violently halted, and their opposing electrical charges force them to chemically lock together into a rigid, highly organized crystalline matrix. This solid ice is not the fragile, temporary frost we experience during a terrestrial winter. At these profound, absolute temperatures, frozen water achieves a mechanical hardness that easily rivals solid granite. It becomes the fundamental, load-bearing bedrock of the outer solar system. Massive planetary crusts, towering mountain ranges stretching miles into the sky, and deep, violent subterranean fault lines are all constructed entirely from this ultra-hardened, frozen water. Out in the dark, ice is the new stone. Because water has physically transitioned into the structural bedrock of these worlds, the definition of magma must also undergo a complete physical inversion. If solid ice acts as the planetary crust, then liquid water functionally becomes the molten rock beneath it. However, keeping water in a fluid state in the outer solar system is incredibly difficult. The absolute vacuum of space is relentlessly pulling thermal energy away from the planetary body. To maintain a fluid state beneath the crust, the water must be heavily fortified with chemical antifreeze. The moons of the gas giants are incredibly rich in volatile compounds, primarily ammonia and methane. When ammonia physically mixes with liquid water, it completely alters the fundamental thermodynamic properties of the fluid. The heavy ammonia molecules physically interrupt the formation of hydrogen bonds between the water molecules, forcefully preventing them from mathematically aligning into a solid crystalline grid. This microscopic chemical interference drastically lowers the freezing point of the subterranean ocean, allowing a thick, highly pressurized slurry of water and ammonia to remain fully fluid even at temperatures that would instantly solidify pure water. This pressurized subsurface slurry acts as the absolute cryo-magma of the outer solar system. It is a heavy, highly viscous fluid that relentlessly circulates miles beneath the solid ice crust, constantly searching for structural weaknesses and tectonic fractures to exploit. We are looking at a planetary architecture that perfectly mirrors the internal mechanics of Earth, but utilizes completely alien, inverted materials. Instead of shifting tectonic plates of heavy silicate rock floating on a pressurized mantle of molten iron, we have colossal tectonic plates of granite-hard ice floating on a pressurized mantle of freezing liquid, ammonia, and water. The physical stage is set, the structural materials are locked into place, but a mechanical engine cannot run without a massive external source of power. In the warm inner solar system, that geological power is provided by the slow, radioactive decay of heavy metals in the planetary core and the overwhelming thermal radiation of the sun. Out in the freezing dark, the sun is functionally useless, and the small rocky cores hidden deep inside these moons are completely insufficient to generate enough localized heat to melt continental-sized oceans. To ignite these frozen forges and keep the oceans from freezing solid, the moons must rely on an entirely different, infinitely more violent source of physical energy. They must draw their localized heat directly from the crushing, invisible weight of the massive gas giants they orbit. To forge a liquid ocean in a thermodynamic environment that aggressively freezes everything into solid bedrock requires an astronomical influx of energy. Since the sun is too distant to provide radiant heat, and the small rocky cores of these moons do not possess enough radioactive material to sustain a long-term thermal engine, the energy must be generated externally. It is generated by pure, unrelenting physical trauma. The massive gas giants like Jupiter and Saturn do not simply hold their moons in orbit with a gentle, invisible tether. They subject these tiny worlds to a continuous, violent mechanical squeezing. This process is known as tidal heating, and it is the true hidden engine of the outer solar system. To understand how gravity can physically melt ice, we must look at the exact orbital mechanics of these moons. If a moon orbited a gas giant in a perfect, mathematically flawless circle, the gravitational pull acting upon it would be absolutely constant. The moon would be locked in a static physical state. However, the orbits of these frozen worlds, such as Europa and Enceladus, are not perfect circles. Because they are constantly gravitationally interacting with other neighboring moons, their paths are slightly pulled out of alignment into elongated, elliptical ovals This means the physical distance between the moon and the massive gas giant is constantly changing every single day. As the tiny moon speeds along its elliptical track and physically swings closer to the colossal mass of the gas giant, the gravitational pull violently intensifies. Gravity is not uniform across a three-dimensional body. The side of the moon facing the planet is pulled significantly harder than the side facing the dark vacuum of space. This immense differential in physical force causes the entire moon to mechanically deform. The solid rocky core and the towering miles of rigid ice crust are forcefully stretched outward, bulging toward the gas giant. The entire world is physically pulled out of a spherical shape and stretched into a massive oval. Then, as the moon continues its orbit and swings further away from the gas giant, the gravitational vice violently releases. The immense physical pull drops, and the moon's own localized gravity forces the stretched rock and ice to snap back into a perfect sphere. This violent, continuous cycle of stretching and relaxing happens relentlessly. Every few days, the entire planetary body is forcefully kneaded like a ball of solid clay. When you take thousands of miles of solid, rigid ice and heavy silicate rock and physically bend them back and forth, you generate an astronomical amount of internal friction. Deep inside the core of the moon, the heavy tectonic plates of rock are relentlessly grinding against one another under the crushing weight of the ocean above. This continuous mechanical grinding acts as a colossal subterranean friction engine. The kinetic energy of the shifting rock is violently converted directly into raw thermal energy. The core of the frozen moon physically heats up, glowing like a massive, overworked industrial brake pad. This localized, frictional heat cannot remain trapped in the core. It violently radiates outward, physically baking the deep subterranean bedrock and transferring massive amounts of thermal energy directly into the ice above it. As the immense heat crashes into the bottom layers of the rigid, frozen crust, it overpowers the chemical bonds holding the water molecules in their crystalline matrix. The solid ice forcefully melts, transitioning from a structural bedrock into a heavily pressurized, dark liquid. The sheer volume of this hidden liquid is staggering. Because the rigid ice crust is miles thick, it acts as a colossal, inescapable pressure cooker lid. The water trapped beneath it is not a calm, serene sea. It is a highly pressurized, violently churning cauldron of fluid dynamics, constantly heated from the bottom and frozen from the top. The immense hydrostatic pressure of the ocean pushes back against the bottom of the ice crust, actively searching for structural weaknesses, microscopic faults, and mechanical fractures to exploit. The continuous flexing of the gravitational vice ensures that the ice armor is never perfectly stable. It is always cracking, always shifting, and always providing a potential escape route for the pressurized cryomagma waiting below. Because the gas giant never stops pulling and the moon never stops orbiting, the gravitational vice never releases. The frictional heat is continuously injected into the system, perfectly balancing the extreme freezing temperatures radiating down from the absolute vacuum of space above. The frozen forge has successfully ignited. A massive global liquid ocean is permanently trapped between the burning friction of the rocky core below and the crushing, freezing weight of the solid ice armor above. To comprehend the sheer physical scale of these subterranean oceans, we must examine the bizarre, highly pressurized mechanics of water itself. On our terrestrial world, water possesses a fundamental and highly unusual physical property. When it transitions from a liquid to a solid state, it physically expands. As the thermal energy is stripped away, the water molecules are forced into a rigid, hexagonal crystalline lattice. This specific geometric arrangement requires a significant amount of microscopic empty space between the individual atoms. Because of this empty space, standard frozen water, scientifically classified as ice, is physically less dense than the liquid it forms from. This is the exact mechanical reason why ice floats on top of a terrestrial lake, creating a solid, floating shield that protects the liquid water below. In the outer solar system, this exact same hexagonal ice forms the towering, miles-thick outer crust of the frozen moons. But as we dive beneath this floating armor and descend deep into the pitch-black alien oceans, the physical rules of water begin to violently break down under the crushing weight of gravity. On a massive moon like Ganymede or Titan, the subterranean ocean is not a shallow terrestrial sea. It is a staggering abyss of liquid water that can stretch hundreds of miles deep. As you descend through this lightless fluid, the hydrostatic pressure continuously multiplies. Every single gallon of water above is physically pushing down on the water below, driven by the relentless, inescapable pull of the moon's gravity. When you reach the absolute bottom of these abyssal oceans, hundreds of miles beneath the floating crust, the physical pressure reaches an astronomical threshold. The weight of the water above is so violently heavy that it begins to overpower the fundamental thermodynamic state of the liquid. Even though the localized temperature near the rocky core might be warm enough to sustain a fluid state, the sheer, crushing mechanical pressure physically forces the water molecules to stop moving. The water is compressed so severely that the molecules are violently shoved together. They can no longer maintain the fluid, chaotic tumbling of a liquid. But they also cannot form the spacious, hexagonal lattice of standard floating ice. The crushing weight physically collapses the empty space inside the crystal. The atoms are mechanically forced to rearrange themselves into a completely new, vastly denser geometric architecture. This process forges an entirely different structural material. It is a high-pressure phase of solid water. As the hydrostatic pressure continues to mount, the ice structurally collapses again and again, shifting into increasingly compact geometric configurations, progressing through bizarre architectural phases like Ice 3, Ice V, and Ice V. But at the absolute extreme limits of planetary pressure, the water is crushed into its most resilient and compact physical form. It is locked into a dense, cubic, crystalline lattice known as Ice 7. Ice 7 completely defies our terrestrial understanding of what a frozen material should be. It is not forged by the absence of heat. It is forged purely by the violent, mechanical application of weight. Because the physical pressure locking the cubic lattice together is so immensely powerful, this specific architecture of ice does not require freezing temperatures to remain solid. In fact, Ice 7 can remain completely solid and structurally sound at temperatures exceeding hundreds of degrees. It is physically possible to have a layer of rock-solid ice that is simultaneously hot enough to melt terrestrial lead. This creates an incredibly complex, layered internal architecture for these massive moons. At the very surface, you have a rigid, freezing crust of standard hexagonal ice floating in the vacuum of space. Beneath that floating armor is a massive, highly pressurized, churning liquid ocean of water and ammonia. But as you reach the bottom of that dark ocean, you do not hit a solid rocky seafloor. Instead, the liquid water is crushed so violently by the hydrostatic pressure that it instantly crystallizes into a towering subterranean mountain range of hot, dense ice 7. This deep layer of high-pressure ice acts as a colossal structural barrier. It completely seals off the liquid ocean above from the hot, frictional rocky core below. The hot ice acts as a planetary anvil, absorbing the violent mechanical heat generated by the gravitational vice and slowly radiating it upward to keep the massive ocean from freezing solid. The frozen forge is a machine built entirely out of water, but a water that has been physically warped by gravity into floating armor, pressurized cryomagma, and a deep, burning bedrock. Between the floating, heavily cratered armor of the surface crust and the superheated, highly pressurized bedrock of the core lies the true mechanical engine of the frozen moons. This is the subterranean ocean, a layer of liquid water so unimaginably vast that it makes the terrestrial oceans of Earth look like shallow, temporary puddles. On a world like Europa, this single global body of entombed water contains more than twice the liquid volume of every ocean, lake, and river on our home planet combined. But this alien sea operates under a completely different set of physical laws than the sunlit waters we are familiar with. The first defining physical characteristic of this entombed ocean is absolute, permanent darkness. On Earth, the solar radiation of the sun penetrates the upper layers of the ocean, driving photosynthesis, heating the surface currents, and providing a massive influx of kinetic energy. In the outer solar system, the blinding white armor of the ice crust violently reflects almost all incoming solar radiation back into the vacuum of space. The photons that manage to strike the surface are entirely absorbed by the uppermost inches of the frost. Absolutely zero light penetrates the miles of solid, rigid ice. The liquid abyss below has never been touched by a single photon of sunlight since the chaotic formation of the solar system billions of years ago. Without the sun to drive the thermodynamic engine from above, the fluid dynamics of this pitch-black ocean are dictated entirely from below. The intense, frictional heat generated by the gravitational vise, the continuous mechanical squeezing of the rocky core, acts as a colossal subterranean furnace. As this raw thermal energy bleeds upward through the deep bedrock, it physically superheats the bottom layer of the entombed ocean. The fundamental laws of fluid dynamics dictate that as a liquid heats up, its molecules vibrate more violently and physically spread apart. The superheated water at the bottom of the abyss becomes significantly less dense than the freezing, heavily pressurized water crushing down from above. This creates a massive thermodynamic instability. The hot, deep water forcefully detaches from the seafloor and begins to violently rise. These rising thermal plumes are colossal. They act as massive, slow-moving physical cylinders of ascending heat, pushing millions of tons of warm water straight up through the crushing darkness. As this rising column of superheated fluid finally collides with the absolute zero temperature of the ice crust ceiling, a violent thermodynamic transfer occurs. The water physically dumps its thermal payload into the ice, actively melting the bottom of the crust and preventing the armor from freezing completely shut. Stripped of its heat, the water rapidly cools, condenses, and becomes physically heavier. It then forcefully plunges back down into the abyss to repeat the cycle. This relentless mechanical churning creates massive global convection currents, effectively turning the entire ocean into a sprawling thermodynamic radiator. But this circulating fluid is not pure distilled water. The violent, continuous grinding of the rocky core and the extreme temperatures of the deep bedrock act as a highly efficient chemical solvent. The water aggressively dissolves the heavy minerals, silicates, and salts from the sea floor. The ocean becomes incredibly saturated with heavy chlorides and sulfates, transforming the entire global sea into a thick, highly corrosive chemical soup. This heavy concentration of dissolved salts fundamentally alters the electromagnetic architecture of the Moon. Because the liquid is saturated with positively and negatively charged ions, the entire subterranean ocean acts as a colossal liquid electrical conductor. As the tiny Moon physically orbits through the massive, chaotic magnetic field of its host gas giant, the conductive saltwater ocean forcefully drags against those invisible magnetic lines. This violent electromagnetic friction generates an intense, localized electrical current directly inside the water, turning the entombed ocean into a massive, planetary-scale dynamo. Simultaneously, the ocean is subjected to the exact same gravitational squeezing that heats the core. The liquid water is physically pulled by the gas giant, creating massive, subterranean tides. Because the water is trapped beneath a rigid, solid ceiling of ice, these tides cannot rise into the open air. Instead, the localized swelling of the ocean forcefully presses up against the bottom of the crust. Millions of tons of heavy, conductive salt water violently scrape against the jagged, inverted ice mountains hanging from the ceiling. This relentless mechanical friction slowly erodes the architectural integrity of the floating armor, physically thinning the ice from the inside out and perfectly priming the geological structure for a catastrophic, explosive surface breach. The immense hydrostatic pressure of the subterranean ocean relentlessly pushes against the rigid, frozen ceiling of the ice crust. Because the entire Moon is constantly being squeezed and stretched by the gravitational vice of its host gas giant, this solid armor is never truly stable. The towering, inverted mountains of ice, hanging beneath the surface, are continuously subjected to extreme physical torque. This mechanical stress causes the thick crust to violently buckle and fracture, opening massive, jagged fault lines that can stretch for hundreds of miles. These tectonic scars are the exact structural weaknesses the pressurized ocean has been searching for. When a deep fracture violently rips open in the ice bedrock, it creates a sudden, catastrophic pressure differential. At the absolute bottom of the miles-thick crust, the heavy saltwater ocean is under immense hydrostatic crushing force. But at the very top of the fracture lies the absolute vacuum of space. The fundamental laws of fluid dynamics dictate that a highly pressurized liquid will violently rush to fill a zero-pressure void. The dark, chemical soup of the ocean is immediately and forcefully injected upward into the newly formed tectonic crack. This ascending column of fluid is the cryo-magma of the outer solar system. It is not composed of molten silicate rock, but of super-chilled liquid water, heavily laced with ammonia and dissolved volatile gases. As this freezing magma violently surges up through the jagged ice fault, it faces a severe thermodynamic hurdle. The walls of the tectonic fracture are composed of solid ice that is hundreds of degrees below zero. To prevent the rising fluid from instantly flash freezing and permanently sealing the crack, the magma relies entirely on its chemical composition. The heavy concentration of ammonia acts as an aggressive chemical antifreeze, physically disrupting the water molecules and preventing them from locking into a solid crystalline matrix, even as the ambient temperature aggressively strips away their thermal energy. But the true mechanical violence of the cryovolcanic engine is unleashed by the rapid drop in physical pressure. As the column of liquid water forcefully ascends higher and higher into the crust, the crushing hydrostatic weight of the ocean below begins to fade. This sudden depressurization triggers a massive chemical phase change within the magma. Deep in the abyss, the extreme pressure forced vast quantities of highly volatile gases such as methane, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide to completely dissolve into the liquid water. They were physically trapped in the fluid. But as the magma rises and the pressure drops, the fluid can no longer contain them. The gases violently exsolve, rapidly boiling out of the liquid and forming millions of microscopic, highly pressurized bubbles. This process is mechanically identical to the explosive opening of a heavily shaken bottle of carbonated fluid, but scaled up to a massive planetary level. As the microscopic gas bubbles form, they violently expand, physically displacing the liquid water and drastically lowering the overall density of the magma. The expanding gas acts as a colossal internal pneumatic pump. It violently accelerates the rising column of slush, forcing the cryomagma to surge upward at terrifying speeds. As the cryomagma violently accelerates, the physical friction of the heavily pressurized fluid grinding against the jagged walls of the fault line generates intense, localized heat. This mechanical friction actively melts the surrounding solid ice, physically widening the tectonic throat of the volcano and allowing an even more massive volume of fluid to rush into the void. The fracture is forcefully eaten away from the inside out by the sheer kinetic force of the ascending ocean. The expanding methane and nitrogen gases do not just push the liquid, they physically tear it apart. The continuous, violent expansion of the microscopic bubbles forcefully shreds the heavy salt water into a chaotic, churning slurry of liquid droplets, solid ice shards, and pressurized gas. This complex, three-phase fluid, liquid, solid, and gas operating simultaneously becomes incredibly abrasive. It acts exactly like a high-velocity industrial sandblaster, relentlessly scouring the rigid ice walls and forcefully ripping away massive frozen boulders that are instantly swept up into the surging current. By the time this chaotic, freezing magma reaches the upper layers of the crust, it is no longer a smooth, continuous column of water. It is a highly compressed, violently turbulent mixture of ammonia-laced slush and expanding volatile gas, physically trapped in a rapidly narrowing tectonic bottleneck. The immense pressure from the ocean below and the expanding gas within completely overpowers the structural integrity of the final, thin layer of surface ice. The frozen planetary forge has transformed the tectonic fracture into a heavily pressurized, vertical cannon, perfectly primed to breach the absolute vacuum of the void. To witness the absolute peak of this mechanical violence, we must turn our focus entirely to the localized orbital mechanics of Saturn. Deep within the sprawling icy debris of the planetary ring system orbits a tiny, incredibly reflective moon named Enceladus. By terrestrial standards of planetary physics, a moon of this minuscule size should possess absolutely zero internal geological heat. Its rocky core is far too small to sustain radioactive decay, and its surface is a blindingly white armor of pure ice that reflects almost all solar radiation back into the absolute vacuum of the void. Yet, the southern hemisphere of this frozen world is actively tearing itself apart. The physical architecture of this destruction is not chaotic. It is highly organized and mathematically precise. Concentrated entirely at the South Pole is a massive geological formation known as the Tiger Stripes. These are not shallow surface cracks. They are four colossal parallel tectonic fissures, massive canyons of solid ice that stretch for roughly 80 miles across the frozen bedrock. They are deep, heavily pressurized wounds that cut completely through the rigid outer crust, plunging straight down into the dark, churning subterranean ocean waiting below. The mechanical engine driving this localized destruction is the immense, relentless gravitational vice of Saturn. Because the orbital track of Enceladus is pulled into a slight elliptical oval by the gravitational resonance of a neighboring moon, Dione, the tiny world is relentlessly squeezed and stretched every single time it completes a rotation. But this tidal stress is not distributed evenly across the spherical body. The rigid ice crust acts as a massive physical shell, and the structural strain of the entire moon is forcefully channeled directly into the thinnest, weakest point of the armor at the South Pole. Every 33 hours, as the tiny moon physically swings closest to the colossal mass of the gas giant, the gravitational pull reaches its absolute maximum. This intense planetary gravity physically grabs the massive tectonic plates on either side of the parallel fissures and violently pulls them apart. The solid ice canyons are forcefully ripped open, widening the tectonic throats and completely exposing the heavily pressurized liquid ocean below to the absolute zero and the hard vacuum of space. The violent depressurization of the subterranean ocean instantly triggers the cryo-volcanic engine. The super-chilled, ammonia-laced salt water and the massive volumes of expanding volatile gases violently surge up through the newly widened fissures, screaming out of the ice at supersonic speeds. The entire south pole of the moon transforms into a massive, heavily active battery of geological cannons, relentlessly blasting millions of tons of subterranean ocean directly into the orbital track. But the physical mechanics of this eruption are strictly governed by the orbital clock. As the moon continues along its elliptical path and physically swings further away from Saturn, the intense gravitational vice is violently released. The immense physical strain on the crust drops, and the towering solid ice walls of the Tiger Stripes forcefully slam back together. The canyons physically crush shut, violently choking off the tectonic throats and instantly terminating the explosive eruption. This is a colossal, mechanical breathing process. The entire southern hemisphere of the moon is acting as a massive, planetary valve. It violently pulls open to vent the pressurized ocean and then violently slams shut. When these massive walls of solid ice crash back together, the sheer mechanical friction of miles of frozen bedrock grinding against itself generates an astronomical amount of localized heat. This frictional heat actively melts the surrounding ice, preventing the fractures from permanently sealing and ensuring the tectonic throats remain perfectly primed for the next violent orbital cycle. The biological fortress of a tree used specialized microscopic valves to vent water into the atmosphere, but this frozen forge uses the raw, inescapable gravity of a gas giant to forcefully rip open the bedrock of the entire world, powering an eruption so massive it physically defies the freezing thermodynamics of the void. When the massive, solid ice walls of the tectonic canyon are forcefully pulled apart by the gravitational vice, the heavily pressurized cryomagma completely loses its physical containment. Deep within the crust, the fluid was tightly bound by the immense, crushing weight of miles of solid bedrock. But the exact millisecond the ascending column of super-chilled salt water breaches the absolute surface of the moon, it is violently subjected to the hardest physical extreme in the universe. It hits the absolute vacuum of space. In a true vacuum, atmospheric pressure drops completely to zero. This total absence of pressure violently shatters the fundamental thermodynamic rules that govern fluid dynamics. On a terrestrial planet, the heavy atmospheric blanket physically pushes down on the surface of a liquid, mechanically forcing the water molecules to remain bound together until they absorb enough thermal energy to break free, the process we recognize as boiling. In the absolute void, there is absolutely no downward physical force holding the liquid together. Because the atmospheric pressure has been completely deleted, the boiling point of the water drops infinitely. The subterranean fluid surging out of the tectonic throat is hovering just slightly above the freezing point, but in the vacuum of space, this super-chilled water is suddenly far too hot for its physical environment. It undergoes an instantaneous, catastrophic phase change. The massive volume of liquid water violently and explosively boils the exact moment it touches the void. This is not a slow, thermodynamic simmer. It is a violent, mechanical detonation. The liquid physically tears itself apart, rapidly expanding into a massive, chaotic cloud of highly energized water vapor. As this gaseous vapor exponentially expands in volume, it acts as a colossal pneumatic accelerator. It physically catches the remaining liquid droplets and violently blasts them out of the jagged ice canyon at supersonic speeds, easily exceeding hundreds of miles per hour. But the void is not merely a vacuum. It is an environment of absolute, unforgiving thermal starvation. As the massive volume of water violently boils, the physical act of evaporation requires an astronomical input of kinetic energy. To transition from a liquid to a gas, the expanding vapor rapidly and aggressively steals whatever residual heat is left in the surrounding fluid. This localized theft of thermal energy causes a secondary, instantaneous thermodynamic shock. Stripped of all their internal heat in a microscopic fraction of a second, the remaining supersonic droplets of liquid water violently flash freeze. The physical shock is so rapid that the water molecules do not have the time to slowly mathematically align into the spacious, hexagonal crystals of standard ice. Instead, they are physically crushed and locked into hyperdense, microscopic shards of solid, ultra-hardened ice. The erupting cryo-volcano is no longer a geyser of liquid water. It is mechanically transformed into a towering supersonic pillar composed entirely of expanding invisible water vapor and billions of microscopic razor-sharp ice crystals. As this colossal eruption shoots out of the tectonic throat, it completely escapes the physical friction of the crust. Because the tiny moon possesses absolutely no atmosphere to generate aerodynamic drag, there is nothing to mechanically slow the ascending column of ice. The geyser shoots hundreds of miles straight up into the absolute blackness of space. As the towering plume reaches the apex of its trajectory, the billions of microscopic ice crystals physically catch the distant, faint radiation of the sun. The invisible eruption instantly transforms into a blindingly bright, towering pillar of frozen light, permanently suspended against the dark void. The mechanical fate of these newly forged ice crystals is dictated entirely by orbital velocity and physical mass. The heaviest particles, the largest shards of flash-frozen ocean, retain enough physical mass to be overpowered by the weak, localized gravity of the Moon. As their kinetic momentum bleeds away in the high orbit, they slowly arc backward and violently fall back to the surface. This localized gravitational capture creates a continuous, heavily localized weather system. A perfectly silent, eternal blizzard of pure white snow constantly rains down upon the South Pole. This massive volume of falling ice relentlessly buries the jagged tectonic fractures, continuously recoating the entire southern hemisphere in a fresh, blindingly reflective layer of heavily armored frost. However, the vast majority of the microscopic ice crystals and the violently expanding gas are moving far too fast. The pneumatic acceleration of the boiling vacuum has forcefully pushed them past the absolute escape velocity of the tiny Moon. They completely sever their gravitational tether to the frozen bedrock. They are forcefully ejected from the localized system and blasted directly into the massive, chaotic orbital track of the host gas giant. The frozen forge has successfully cracked its own armor, boiled its subterranean ocean, and exported billions of tons of physical mass directly into the cosmos. While the localized, pressurized geysers of the tiny moons perfectly demonstrate the violent power of the vacuum to witness a truly global mechanical engine, we must travel inward to the massive gravitational well of Jupiter. Here, orbiting in the dark, is a world roughly the size of our own moon, completely encased in a blindingly bright armor of solid water. This is Europa. Unlike the isolated, parallel canyons at the south pole of Enceladus, the entire outer crust of Europa is a continuous, heavily fractured, and relentlessly shifting tectonic puzzle. On Earth, tectonic plates are composed of heavy silicate rock, physically floating on a highly pressurized, localized mantle of molten iron and magma. Because the Earth's crust is deeply tethered to the extreme friction of the mantle below, the continental plates move at an incredibly slow, agonizing pace. On Europa, the physical architecture of the planet completely decouples the crust from the core. The miles of rigid, frozen bedrock are physically resting entirely on a global, liquid, subterranean ocean. This creates a frictionless geological bearing. The entire outer shell of the moon is completely untethered from the rocky core, allowing the massive continental plates of solid ice to freely float and violently slide across the dark abyss below. The mechanical force driving this global movement is the localized thermodynamic convection of the ocean itself. As the superheated thermal plumes violently rise from the hot, frictional core at the absolute bottom of the sea, they crash directly into the underside of the floating ice armor. This massive, upward kinetic energy physically drags against the jagged, inverted mountains hanging from the ceiling. The ocean is literally pushing the crust. As the deep, circulating currents flow horizontally beneath the ice, they act as a colossal conveyor belt, physically forcing the massive tectonic plates to drift across the surface of the moon. When two continental plates of solid, heavily compressed ice physically collide, the mechanical result is fundamentally different from a terrestrial earthquake. When rock plates collide on Earth, their sheer density and structural integrity force them to crumple upward, permanently forging towering, jagged mountain ranges. But the frozen bedrock of Europa is highly brittle at the absolute zero temperatures of the surface. When millions of tons of rigid, frozen water forcefully grind against each other, the leading edges of the massive plates do not fold. They systematically and catastrophically shatter. The immense kinetic energy of the collision violently pulverizes the solid bedrock. Massive, jagged blocks of ice, some the size of terrestrial cities, are physically snapped off the main tectonic plates. But they do not simply fall away. The extreme physical trauma of the collision simultaneously generates intense, localized frictional heat, forcefully melting the immediate area and creating a heavily pressurized upwelling of the thick, ammonia-laced cryo-magma from the ocean below. The pulverized, continental blocks of solid ice are violently thrust into this rising slurry of semi-liquid slush. They become temporarily suspended in the pressurized fluid, floating chaotically like massive, jagged icebergs in a localized, freezing sea. The extreme gravitational tides of Jupiter physically pull and twist these floating blocks, forcefully rotating them, tilting them on their sides, and completely destroying any pre-existing geological alignment. Then, as the moon continues its orbit and the gravitational vice temporarily relaxes, the localized frictional heat rapidly dissipates into the absolute vacuum of space. The pressurized slurry of cryomagma instantly flash freezes, physically welding the chaotic, jumbled blocks of pulverized bedrock back into a solid, rigid matrix. This brutal mechanical process creates vast, sprawling regions across the moon known as chaos terrain. They are massive, highly disorganized graveyards of shattered tectonic plates, permanently frozen in the exact moment of their violent collision. But a planetary crust cannot continuously expand and shatter without eventually running out of physical space. For new tectonic plates to form from the freezing ocean below, older plates must be systematically destroyed. Europa achieves this physical balance through a brutal process of mechanical subduction. When a thinner, newly formed plate of ice is forcefully pushed against an older, vastly thicker plate, the immense horizontal pressure forces the weaker ice to buckle downward. The leading edge of the thin plate is violently driven beneath the heavy armor, completely breaking its contact with the vacuum of space and plunging straight down into the superheated, pressurized darkness of the subterranean ocean. As the solid ice is forcefully dragged into the churning abyss, the immense thermal energy of the deep water aggressively attacks the frozen matrix. The subducting plate is physically melted from the bottom up, entirely dissolving back into the global sea and perfectly resetting the physical mass of the frozen forge. Because the entire outer crust is continuously shattering into chaos terrain and violently subducting back into the abyss, the biological and geological history of the moon is completely erased. The surface of Europa is permanently young, relentlessly physically recycling its own bedrock and completely destroying any impact craters left by colliding asteroids. It is a world that is constantly, mechanically repaving itself with the frozen, pulverized remains of its own deep ocean. beneath the shifting, shattered armor of the chaos terrain, and plunging hundreds of miles down through the pitch-black, highly pressurized liquid of the global ocean, we finally reach the true physical foundation of the frozen world. This is the rocky core. To human intuition, the bottom of an ocean is a quiet, permanent graveyard where heavy sediment slowly gathers in the absolute dark. But in the outer solar system, the seafloor is the most violently active, heavily pressurized thermodynamic environment on the entire moon. The heavy silicate rock that forms the core of Europa or Enceladus is not a perfectly smooth, impermeable sphere, because the entire planetary body is continuously subjected to the relentless stretching and squeezing of the gravitational vise. The deep bedrock is heavily fractured. Massive tectonic fault lines, deep physical canyons, and sprawling networks of microscopic cracks penetrate miles down into the solid rock. The immense, crushing hydrostatic weight of the subterranean ocean above physically forces the freezing, heavy salt water down into these jagged crevices. As the dark water is relentlessly pushed deeper into the rocky core, it moves closer to the absolute center of the gravitational friction. The continuous grinding of the continental plates generates an astronomical amount of raw thermal energy. The intruding salt water physically collides with this subterranean furnace. Under normal atmospheric conditions, water exposed to such extreme heat would violently boil and instantly transition into a gas. But at the bottom of the abyssal ocean, the crushing physical pressure of the water above completely prevents the formation of expanding vapor. The water is mechanically forced to remain a liquid, transitioning into a highly energized, superheated state. This superheated fluid becomes an incredibly aggressive chemical solvent. As it violently circulates through the deep fractures, it actively strips the solid rock of its chemical identity. The water forcefully dissolves heavy metals, raw iron, massive quantities of sulfur, and dense silicates directly from the bedrock. The fluid transforms from a freezing salt water into a heavily saturated, superheated chemical broth. Because this superheated fluid is physically vastly hotter than the surrounding ocean water, its density rapidly drops. It becomes violently buoyant. The immense thermal expansion forcefully drives the heavy fluid back up through the subterranean fractures, completely overpowering the downward crushing weight of the abyss. The fluid accelerates, violently surging upward until it erupts from the rocky sea floor directly into the absolute freezing darkness of the alien ocean. The exact millisecond this superheated, heavily saturated fluid physically collides with the freezing, pressurized water of the global sea, a catastrophic thermodynamic shock occurs. The violent kinetic energy of the hot fluid is instantly stripped away by the inescapable cold. As the erupting fluid rapidly cools, its physical ability to hold the dissolved heavy metals and sulfur completely collapses. The chemical bonds instantly shatter. The heavy minerals violently precipitate out of the fluid, mechanically transitioning from a dissolved, invisible state back into millions of solid, microscopic particles. To an observer in the absolute dark, this eruption would not look like a clear geyser of water. It would look like a violently billowing cloud of thick, pitch-black smoke permanently pouring out of the seafloor. But these solid microscopic particles are heavily influenced by the crushing gravity of the moon. As they are violently ejected from the tectonic vent, their upward kinetic momentum quickly bleeds away. They physically fall back down to the seabed, settling directly around the exact rim of the geological fracture. As millions of tons of these dense minerals continuously precipitate and fall, they mechanically weld together. They begin to physically build. Layer by layer, year after year, the heavily mineralized rock forcefully stacks itself upward, constructing towering, highly organized physical pillars. These are the abyssal chimneys. They are massive, heavily armored geological exhaust pipes, constructed entirely out of the precipitated heavy metals of the core. Some of these towering structures can reach hundreds of feet into the dark ocean, acting as localized, continuously erupting thermodynamic vents. They stand completely alone in the crushing, lightless abyss, relentlessly blasting raw thermal energy and heavy chemical elements into the freezing sea above. The frozen forge has successfully established its internal plumbing, connecting the burning, frictional heat of the deep rock directly to the freezing, circulating currents of the global ocean. To a terrestrial biologist, the absolute darkness of the abyssal ocean represents an insurmountable physical barrier to the synthesis of complex organic chemistry. On Earth, the fundamental engine of biological construction is photosynthesis. It requires the kinetic energy of a solar photon to physically violently strike a microscopic panel of chlorophyll, generating the localized electrical current necessary to hammer raw carbon and water into heavy chains of glucose. But at the bottom of a frozen moon, buried beneath miles of solid, floating ice and hundreds of miles of crushing, heavily pressurized salt water, not a single photon of sunlight has ever penetrated. The environment is entirely starved of solar radiation. If the frozen forge is to manufacture the complex, heavy organic molecules necessary for life, it must completely abandon the sun. It must replace the gentle kinetic energy of solar radiation with the violent, brute force thermodynamics of the abyssal chimneys. It must rely entirely on chemosynthesis. This mechanical process of dark alchemy is not driven from above. It is driven entirely from below, as the superheated, heavily saturated fluid violently erupts from the towering chimneys. It is packed with dissolved inorganic gases, primarily hydrogen sulfide, methane, and raw molecular hydrogen. These gases were physically ripped from the subterranean bedrock by the extreme heat and pressure of the deep core. But to build a complex organic molecule, such as an amino acid or a heavy hydrocarbon chain, these raw chemical ingredients must be forcefully welded together. They require a localized spike of extreme kinetic energy and a physical template to guide the reaction. The exact millisecond the superheated fluid from the chimney collides with the freezing, heavy salt water of the global ocean, a massive thermodynamic gradient is instantly created. You have a highly concentrated jet of scalding, pressurized chemicals physically crashing into an infinite reservoir of sub-zero, heavily oxidized water. The necessary chemical oxidants in the ocean, primarily oxygen and hydrogen peroxide, were not generated locally. They were forged miles above, on the absolute surface of the moon. As the raw, chaotic radiation of the host gas giant relentlessly bombards the rigid ice crust, it physically shatters the frozen water molecules, violently ripping the hydrogen away from the oxygen. Over millions of years, the continuous shifting and subducting of the tectonic ice plates forcefully drag these heavy oxidants down into the churning abyss, eventually delivering them directly to the seafloor. When the hydrogen sulfide from the chimney violently mixes with the heavy oxidants from the surface, the opposing chemical charges fiercely react. The intense thermodynamic shock of the mixing fluids physically strips the electrons away from the sulfur atoms. This instantaneous transfer of electrons acts exactly like a microscopic, localized battery. It generates a massive surge of raw chemical energy, but chemical energy alone in a chaotic, churning ocean will simply dissipate. To forge complex, highly organized organic molecules, the chemical reaction must be mechanically anchored. The towering, solid structures of the abyssal chimneys provide this exact physical anchor. As the precipitated heavy metals, specifically iron and nickel sulfides, build up to form the jagged walls of the vent, they act as massive, heavily armored catalytic templates. The microscopic surfaces of these metal walls are not smooth. They are highly complex, crystalline grids. When the dissolved carbon, methane, and energized electrons physically crash into the chimney walls, the iron and nickel physically grab the loose atoms. The sheer hydrostatic pressure of the abyss mechanically crushes the carbon and hydrogen atoms directly against the crystalline grid of the metal, holding them violently in place, while the thermal energy of the vent forcefully hammers them together. The heavy metal wall acts as a biological anvil. It mechanically aligns the raw atoms and physically forces them to chemically bond, entirely bypassing the need for a solar photon. Through this relentless, violent physical process, the frozen forge actively manufactures massive chains of heavy, complex organic molecules. It builds long chains of lipids, complex carbohydrates, and the fundamental amino acids required to assemble biological proteins. These heavy molecules are continuously blasted out of the chimney and swept up by the massive, churning convection currents of the subterranean ocean. The absolute darkness of the alien sea is heavily seeded with the exact structural components of life, forged entirely by the violent combination of extreme hydrostatic pressure, localized friction, and the relentless mechanical squeezing of a massive gas giant. To witness the ultimate consequence of a gravitational vice, we must leave the immediate vicinity of Jupiter and Saturn and travel to the absolute frozen edge of the planetary system. Orbiting the massive ice giant Neptune is a world that mechanically does not belong there. This is Triton. Unlike the native moons that were forged from the primordial debris disk swirling around their host planets, Triton is a planetary interloper. It is a massive, heavily armored dwarf planet that was violently captured from the deep, chaotic debris of the Kuiper Belt by Neptune's inescapable gravitational well billions of years ago. The physical mechanics of this ancient capture were violently destructive. To slow down enough to be permanently locked into Neptune's orbit, Triton had to physically bleed off an astronomical amount of kinetic energy. It achieved this deceleration by plunging directly through Neptune's original, pre-existing system of native moons. It acted as a colossal wrecking ball, violently shattering the smaller moons and absorbing their orbital momentum until its own chaotic trajectory stabilized into a massive, highly eccentric oval. Over millions of years, the immense tidal friction from Neptune forcefully crushed this elongated oval down into a perfectly circular track. But because it was violently snagged from deep space rather than naturally forming alongside the gas giant, Triton's orbital architecture is physically broken. Almost every single major moon in the solar system orbits its host planet in the exact same direction that the planet rotates. a mechanical synchronization known as a prograde orbit. Triton operates in direct physical rebellion to this universal law. It travels in a massive retrograde orbit, relentlessly flying backward against the rotational spin of Neptune. This inverted orbital track creates a catastrophic mechanical problem. When a standard moon orbits a planet, the gravitational pull creates a massive tidal bulge of displaced water and atmospheric gas on the host planet. Because the planet is spinning on its axis vastly faster than the moon is orbiting, this heavy bulge is physically dragged slightly ahead of the moon. The gravitational mass of that leading bulge constantly pulls the moon forward, physically pumping kinetic energy into its orbit and slowly pushing it further out into the safety of deep space. For Triton, the physics are violently reversed. Because it is flying backward against the rotation of the planet, the tidal bulge on Neptune is constantly lagging physically behind the moon. The immense gravitational mass of that trailing planetary bulge acts as a colossal, invisible tether. It is relentlessly pulling backward on Triton, forcefully dragging against its forward momentum and actively robbing the moon of its orbital kinetic energy. Triton is functionally flying with its structural brakes permanently locked. Every single day, the physical friction of this gravitational drag forces the massive moon to decelerate. As its forward velocity continuously bleeds away into the void, the moon can no longer maintain its altitude against the crushing pull of the gas giant. It is locked in an inescapable, agonizingly slow inward spiral. It is physically falling toward Neptune. This relentless inward spiral subjects the rigid ice crust of Triton to continuously increasing mechanical torque. The gravitational vice is not just squeezing the moon, it is actively crushing it harder and harder with every passing century. The physical strain forcefully shatters the frozen bedrock, creating a highly complex, deeply scarred tectonic landscape that is entirely unique to this doomed world. The solid crust is violently buckling under the escalating gravitational weight, melting the deep subsurface layers through sheer kinetic friction and driving an entirely new variation of a cryovolcanic engine. But a planetary body cannot physically fall into a gas giant intact. As Triton is relentlessly dragged closer and closer to Neptune, the gravitational gradient becomes incredibly steep. It will eventually cross a fatal mathematical threshold known as the Roche limit. At this specific orbital altitude, the differential gravitational pull, the sheer difference in physical force between the side of the moon facing the planet and the side facing the void, will completely overpower the internal mechanical strength holding the bedrock together. The solid ice and heavy silicate core will no longer be able to maintain their spherical architecture. When Triton finally breaches this invisible boundary, the entire world will be catastrophically dismantled. The massive tectonic plates will be forcefully ripped away from the core. The subsurface oceans will instantly flash freeze as they are exposed to the vacuum, and the entire dwarf planet will be violently shredded into billions of microscopic ice fragments. The frozen forge will be completely destroyed, its physical mass forcefully repurposed to build a colossal, blindingly bright ring system around Neptune. As the doomed moon relentlessly falls toward the gas giant, the physical composition of its outer armor introduces an entirely new mechanical engine. Unlike Europa or Enceladus, which are primarily armored in rigid, solid water, the extreme distance of Triton from the Sun drops the ambient temperature to roughly 400 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. In this profound state of thermal starvation, completely different volatile chemicals physically freeze into solid bedrock. The sprawling southern hemisphere of Triton is completely paved in a massive, continuous sheet of solid nitrogen ice. Nitrogen, which exists as a chaotic, highly energetic gas in the warm terrestrial atmosphere of Earth, is physically stripped of its kinetic energy and mechanically crushed into a transparent, crystalline solid. This sprawling nitrogen glacier acts as a massive optical lens. Because the solid nitrogen is highly translucent, it completely alters the fundamental thermodynamics of the crust. When the microscopic, highly degraded solar radiation from the distant sun finally reaches the moon, the photons do not physically bounce off a blindingly white surface. Instead, they pass directly through the top layer of the clear nitrogen armor. The light penetrates deep into the frozen bedrock until it physically collides with a subterranean layer of darker, highly complex organic molecules and heavy silicate dust trapped beneath the ice. These dark subterranean particles act as localized thermal anchors. They physically absorb the kinetic energy of the solar photons, rapidly heating up in the absolute dark. The thermal energy violently radiates outward into the surrounding solid nitrogen. But because the clear ice above is a terrible conductor of heat, the thermal energy is completely physically trapped. This creates a highly localized, solid-state greenhouse effect operating entirely within the bedrock. As the dark particles continue to forcefully pump heat into the surrounding ice, the localized temperature slowly creeps upward. It eventually crosses a highly specific, catastrophic thermodynamic threshold. The solid nitrogen bedrock does not melt into a liquid. The ambient physical pressure of the moon is far too low to sustain a fluid state. Instead, it forcefully sublimates. The rigid crystalline matrix of the ice instantly shatters, and the solid nitrogen physically transitions directly into a highly energetic, expanding gas. This expanding gas becomes a heavily pressurized, subterranean pneumatic bomb. As the volume of the invisible gas exponentially increases, the immense physical pressure violently pushes back against the solid, translucent ice ceiling above. The localized structural strain becomes astronomical. The heavy ice is physically bent and stretched until the rigid nitrogen armor catastrophically fails. A jagged, microscopic fracture violently rips through the crust, and the highly pressurized pocket of subterranean gas forcefully detonates. The expanding nitrogen violently rushes up through the jagged throat of the fracture, instantly accelerating to supersonic speeds. But this erupting geyser is not invisible. As the pressurized gas violently tears its way out of the subterranean pocket, it physically rips billions of microscopic, dark, organic particles and heavy silicate dust directly from the bedrock. This heavy, dark material is violently swept up into the surging pneumatic column. The eruption blasts through the surface and shoots straight up into the void, forming a towering, pitch-black pillar of heavily pressurized gas and solid debris. These dark plumes act as massive, geological exhaust pipes, venting the violent thermodynamic pressure of the solid-state greenhouse directly into the sky. As the towering column reaches an altitude of roughly 5 miles, it finally hits the extreme upper limits of Triton's incredibly thin, localized atmosphere. The sheer physical friction of the atmospheric wind forcefully catches the top of the plume, violently shearing the dark dust horizontally and smearing massive, pitch-black streaks across the otherwise pristine, transparent nitrogen glaciers. The frozen forge is actively ripping its own bedrock apart from the inside out, powered entirely by the trapped, microscopic kinetic energy of a distant star. The towering pillars of flash-frozen water and heavily pressurized gas erupting from the tiny moons of the outer solar system do not simply vanish into the absolute void. The physical mass ejected by these localized thermodynamic engines must go somewhere. When a microscopic ice crystal is forcefully accelerated past the escape velocity of a moon like Enceladus, it severs its gravitational tether to the frozen bedrock, but it does not escape the localized system. The exact millisecond the ice shard leaves the immediate gravitational influence of the moon, it is violently captured by a vastly more powerful physical force. It is snagged by the inescapable, crushing gravitational well of the host gas giant. This transition of gravitational ownership completely alters the mechanical trajectory of the ice. The billions of microscopic, frozen particles do not fall toward the massive planet. Because they inherited the immense orbital momentum of the moon they erupted from, they are forcefully slung into a sprawling, high-velocity circular track around the gas giant. To a distant observer, this massive accumulation of orbiting ice appears as a solid, continuous, and mathematically perfect disk of blinding white light. These are the planetary ring systems. But a ring is not a solid physical structure. It is a highly chaotic, violently active orbital highway. It is constructed entirely from trillions of individual, disconnected fragments of solid water, ranging in size from microscopic dust grains to massive, jagged boulders of pure ice. These individual fragments are relentlessly traveling at supersonic speeds, locked in a continuous state of mechanical freefall around the planetary equator. Because the orbital track is so densely packed with physical mass, the individual ice shards are constantly and violently colliding with one another. The kinetic energy of these microscopic impacts physically pulverizes the larger boulders, continuously grinding the frozen bedrock down into an ultra-fine, highly reflective powder. The sheer mechanical friction of these orbital collisions forcefully flattens the chaotic cloud of debris into an incredibly thin, razor-sharp disk, strictly dictated by the conservation of angular momentum. But a planetary ring system is not a permanent architectural fixture. The microscopic dust particles are continuously subjected to extreme physical degradation. The raw, unfiltered ultraviolet radiation from the distant sun violently attacks the frozen water, physically stripping the hydrogen atoms away and slowly eroding the mass of the rings. Furthermore, the extreme magnetic field of the gas giant relentlessly drags against the charged particles in the ice, actively sapping their orbital velocity and forcefully pulling them down into the crushing atmosphere of the planet to be destroyed. If a ring system is not continuously resupplied with fresh physical mass, the fundamental laws of orbital mechanics dictate that it will completely evaporate and fall out of the sky within a few million years. The immense rings of Saturn are not an ancient, static relic of the early solar system. They are actively and aggressively being manufactured right now. The tiny, heavily fractured moon of Enceladus is physically orbiting directly inside the widest, outermost boundary of the ring system, the massive E-ring. As the gravitational vice relentlessly tears open the tiger stripes at the South Pole and the subterranean ocean violently boils into the vacuum, the Moon acts as a colossal planetary 3D printer. It is actively venting its own internal physical mass directly into the orbital track. Every single second, hundreds of pounds of super-chilled, flash-frozen salt water are forcefully injected into the ring, perfectly replacing the ice that is continuously destroyed by radiation and magnetic drag. The frozen forge is literally sacrificing its own global ocean to physically build and maintain the orbital architecture of the gas giant. When we look at the extreme outer edges of our solar system, we are not looking at a stagnant, frozen wasteland completely devoid of geological activity. We are witnessing the ultimate expression of raw mechanical power. We are looking at a localized universe where the inescapable, crushing gravity of giant planets completely replaces the thermal radiation of the sun. It is a thermodynamic landscape where water is crushed into structural bedrock, where global oceans of liquid ammonia and heavy salt water are trapped beneath miles of floating armor, and where the relentless physical friction of the void violently tears worlds apart to build towering, blindingly bright rings of shattered ice. The outer dark is a sprawling, interconnected network of highly pressurized engines, forever operating in the absolute zero and relentlessly repaving the architecture of the cosmos.